Hey Jacob, I forgot to mention that now that you have that Bible, there'll be a test every Sunday that you come. You gotta get studying up. You've got a good teacher named Ben, he'll help you. I'm just kidding. No testing. Just a quick word of thanks. This is why we exist. This is why we gather together as a church community. So that the next generation has adequate access to God's holy word. A word that you've come to know, a word that you've studied, a word that you've reflected on, a word that shapes us as the people of God. Because of your generosity, we are able to in return provide these resources for our kids and for their families. So that at home they have a Bible to read, to learn about God's encompassing story of love and promise and care. So on behalf of these two and all of the kids that call this church home, thank you for your faithfulness and your commitment to this place. Speaking of God's encompassing story of love, we've jumped ahead. We are now in Exodus. If you were with us last week, we were only 25 verses into Genesis, and we've made a pretty big leap into Exodus. Last week, Pastor Amanda talked about the wrestling of Jacob and the conversation that Jacob has with God. We are already through the end of Genesis, and we are into the first few chapters of Exodus. And we are at a spot where God's chosen people, the Israelites, have left their homes and they have gathered, they have traveled through Jacob's family to Egypt, and they have become slaves to Pharaoh there in Egypt. They're living as slaves. They don't have a choice as to when they work. They don't have a choice as to when they eat or when they sleep. As a slave, they are now under Pharaoh's rule. And as you can imagine, when somebody is ever forced in a situation like that, there's a lot of grumbling and there's a lot of frustration and tiredness. These are God's chosen people have been put into this situation. And what we heard this morning in the dramatic reading was the reminder for us of the promise that God has made. The promise that it says, as God is talking to Moses, the promise that God had made to their ascendants, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And in that promise, that covenant, is that God would never leave God's chosen people. God was never going to abandon them. And to be able to uphold and to sustain this promise, we have God coming in and interceding on behalf of God's chosen people here now who are living in slavery, but God has a strategic plan. He's met with his advisory council. They've come up with a mission statement. They have 6 steps to their... I'm just kidding. But God has a plan in place, right? God is ready to execute. God is ready to not fall back on God's covenant. Because God will never fall back on the promises that God makes. Page by page by page, we are constantly brought back to that never-ending promise and commitment to the covenant, to the promises that God has made with God's people. So God has a plan. He has worked to come up with an exit strategy to get God's chosen people out of slavery. And if, when somebody comes up with a big plan, you need somebody to be the messenger. And so in walks Moses. And what I want to talk about this morning is how much you are like Moses. So Moses was a shepherd. He was out in the field tending his flock, minding his business. I like to think maybe it was mid to late afternoon, after you have a pretty hearty lunch and your eyelids get a little heavy. He's found a shady spot to lean up against a tree, ready to not fall asleep because he has a responsibility to his flock, but maybe dozing off a little bit. And off in the distance, he sees this burning bush. And he falls back asleep, and the burning bush will take care of itself. Wakes up a little later. I'm making this part up, but just go with me, right? Wakes up a little later. By golly, that same bush is burning, but it looks the same as it did 45 minutes earlier. The bush is on fire, but it's not going anywhere. And so Moses starts to pay attention. There's God's hook. God has pulled Moses in and is about to deliver the call, God's call to Moses. And he says to Moses, I have made a covenant, I have made a promise to my people. To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I have made a promise to those people, and I'm not going to back down from that, and I need your help. I need you to go on my behalf to tell my people we're going to get out of Egypt, and we're eventually on our way to the promised land. I need you, Moses. I'm calling you from this burning bush that isn't burning up. I'm calling you into a life of ministry. What does Moses do? Nope. Got the wrong guy, God. You see, you want me to go talk to people, and see, I'm a little slow when I talk, and I don't really have any clear thoughts, and so, not me. 5 times, Moses comes up with an excuse, a reroute, a redirect of saying, hey, God, not me. You've got the wrong person. You're going to have to go find someone else. Have you ever done that? Have you ever sensed, as God has nudged you, encouraged you, called you, to quickly scramble and think, oh, wrong number. You called the wrong person. I understand you're calling me to go and do this, but whoa, I can't do that. And I think we do it all the time, right? If we go back to Luther's theology and this sense of vocation, what Luther was incredibly passionate about was to understand that all of us had a call to ministry. I found this really helpful quote. Luther said, the maid who sweeps her kitchen is doing the will of God just as much as the monk who prays. Not because she may sing a Christian hymn as she sweeps, because God loves clean floors. The shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes. Because God is interested in all the work. So we all have been called into this work amongst God's kingdom and amongst one another. And some of us have been able to say yes, and some of us have been a little hesitant to step up when we sense that nudge, that call, that encouragement from God. Look what God does with Moses. I mean, the fact is, God doesn't give up. God says, well, what about your brother Aaron? We can bring him along, and Aaron and Moses can travel together. The two of you can go together. And eventually we know that Moses indeed is the one that becomes the spokesperson on behalf of God and on behalf of God's people that will bring them out of slavery. Moses is able to get to a spot where he can put the list of no's to the side and start to say yes. When I think about my own call story and how I ended up here, I've shared with some of you often, I think we pastors get, when did you know you wanted to be a pastor? And actually I was 15 when I knew I wanted to be a pastor. I had a great mentor growing up, Don Escher, at our church in Brooklyn Park, who gave me some opportunities and some good conversation to reflect on it. It just was going to be a matter of when. Right out of college, I was working as a youth director with one of my best friends from high school, and we were having the time of our lives. doing great work together. Things were going well at the church we were working at. And it constantly in the back of my mind, I was like, well, yeah, I got to get to seminary. But I'd come up with excuses like, whoa, I just started this great relationship with this wonderful woman, Jenny. I can't go to seminary now. Oh, I can't go to seminary now because, I mean, these kids, they'll miss me. You know, we've got a good youth ministry program going. I can't go now. Oh, I can't go to seminary. I mean, that's for the smart people. How am I ever going to get my... I mean, the excuses were one after the other, after the other, after the other, as to why it wasn't the time. But we have a pretty persistent, annoying God that sticks with us. The end of June in 2003, I traveled down to the Quad Cities, and I had been invited to officiate a wedding of my friends Chris and Sarah. And I wasn't ordained yet, so we hired a judge. This was before you could do that annoying, like, getordained.com. And so for $25, you could be ordained this afternoon. Like, that was before this stuff existed. So we had a judge there to make it official, so they actually could be a married couple. But I had the opportunity to do the whole service. It was remarkable. And at the reception, my buddy's dad came up to me, Jerry, and he said, John, I don't know when the date will be, but I'm going to book you for my funeral. It was those words of encouragement, that opportunity to step up in a leadership role that's often associated with pastoral ministry. And Jenny and I made the long drive up from the Quad Cities back to Minneapolis, and I finally uttered the words, I think it's time. We were about to be engaged. We were going to be married that next year. But I had said no long enough to live into who I was sensing God was calling me to be. I'd like to be able to stand here and tell you that I have, since that day, every time I felt that nudge from God, stood up and didn't come up with the excuses, didn't find the no's to where God was pushing or nudging me, but that isn't true. I don't think we ever get to that point. But my encouragement this morning is that we stop being like Moses and we start trusting, which is a really hard thing. I get it. But we start trusting that God can use someone like me. God can use someone like you to be the teller of the good news, to help build community, to be the voice of oppression where that needs to be the case, to bring people together and to share the love of Christ with the people that you are around. We don't have to say no anymore. Because God equips us. God gives us what it takes. And instead of the long laundry list of excuses, might we be encouraged to start saying yes? To take a little bit of a step out there and see what happens. The worst case is it's just not going to go well, and we'll step back and try again. But God has enough trust in you. God has a desire for you to live into that call. Trust it. You will be equipped with what you need. So that, and only so that God's word may be known by all, in all places, and in all times. May we start saying yes to our ever-persistent, annoying God.
Amen. Oh, yeah.